As twilight descended, I reluctantly ventured into the backyard to feed Aaron, my faithful dog. I had an aversion to being outside at night, mainly due to my belief in ghosts, witches, and all manner of supernatural entities, a belief that my mother often ridiculed me for. We were sharing a home, and she assigned the task of feeding Aaron as one of my chores. I often fantasized about her reaction if some street thugs were to accost me during one of these nightly excursions. In that hypothetical scenario, she would be mourning at my funeral, regretting ever making me go outside after dark. Lost in my dark thoughts, I nearly jumped out of my skin when Aaron suddenly erupted into a fit of barking. I scanned the surroundings, my heart pounding, but I could discern nothing unusual. It was probably just a stray cat or some other innocuous creature. Shushing Aaron, I proceeded to serve his meal. However, as I turned to leave, I heard a faint rustling sound behind me. My gasp echoed in the night as I frantically scanned the darkness for the source of the noise. There was nothing. Nerves on edge, I hastened my steps back to the house, where the wind was howling through the trees, and Aaron resumed his frenzied barking. My anxiety was reaching its peak, and then, to my utter shock, I spotted a nun standing in my yard, partially concealed by the bushes. I kid you not, a nun was there, her gaze fixed upon me in an eerie silence. Panic surged through me as I stepped back, muttering, "Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God." My mind raced, searching for anything that could serve as a makeshift weapon. I was convinced I had a malevolent ghostly nun in my yard, and my overactive imagination began to craft horrifying scenarios in which she would murder me and hide my lifeless body somewhere my mother would never discover. In sheer terror, I screamed for help, and the nun abruptly turned and melted into the shadows. My mother, alarmed by my cries, rushed to my side, her eyes wide with concern as she inquired about the source of my distress. I contemplated revealing the truth that I had seen a nun, but the fear of being deemed insane and potentially locked away forced me to alter my account. Instead, I told her that I thought I had seen a person in the yard, to which she dismissively attributed it to my vivid imagination, instructing me to retire to bed. Yet, I was steadfast in my certainty about what I had witnessed. The following day at school, I eagerly anticipated sharing my chilling encounter with Stella, my closest friend. I had expected her to react with a similar sense of alarm, but to my dismay, she simply laughed it off and attributed my fear to an overdose of horror movies. As the day progressed, the news of my supposed eerie encounter with a mysterious nun spread throughout the school, and soon enough, my peers joined in the jesting and mockery. It felt as though nobody believed me. That night, sleep eluded me, and I huddled under my covers, dreading the possibility of catching sight of the nun looming over my bed. My knowledge about nuns was quite limited. My parents had been religious in the past, but my mother had long abandoned her church attendance. All I knew about nuns came from the movies, which often portrayed them as sinister figures. Summoning my courage, I ventured outside once more. My apprehensive gaze swept over the yard, but there was no sign of the nun. In the ensuing days, I began to let my guard down. Perhaps I thought the nun had existed solely within the confines of my imagination. Meanwhile, Stella continued to tease me relentlessly. She adopted a sarcastic tone, inquiring about more visits from the creepy nun, which only served to provoke my anger. My patience with Stella was wearing thin. She was proving to be an unreliable friend, frequently demonstrating a lack of empathy and occasionally resorting to cruelty. Nevertheless, I had no alternative companions, so I persisted in her company. Then, one fateful night, while I was occupied with feeding Aaron, he once again erupted into a frenzied barking fit. I cautiously turned toward the source of his agitation and was horrified to behold the nun, partially concealed among the bushes. Suppressing the impulse to scream aloud, I held my tongue, fearful that my mind might be playing tricks on me, causing hallucinations. Gathering what remained of my courage, I confronted the mysterious figure, demanding, "What do you want?" To my astonishment, she emerged from the shadows and took a step forward. "Ruby," she calmly stated, "don't be afraid." For a brief, terrifying moment, I screamed uncontrollably, fully succumbing to my fear. Admittedly, I was utterly petrified. "How do you know my name?" I stammered. "Come closer," she invited, her voice strangely alluring. My instinct was to flee, but an inexplicable curiosity tugged at me. Initially, I had envisioned her as an intimidating elderly woman. Yet, as she emerged from the shadows, I noticed that she was younger than I had imagined, and there was an undeniable beauty about her. She introduced herself as Kennedy, revealing that she was my godmother. I was dumbfounded. Huh? I blurted out. It was true. She had once been my mother's closest friend, but they had a falling out years ago, resulting in an estrangement that had endured ever since. Kennedy had entered a strict convent where contact with friends and family was prohibited. However, her increasing loneliness had driven her to covertly slip away from the convent. I wanted to meet you, she explained, her eyes filled with longing. I hadn't seen you since you were a baby. A thought crossed my mind. Why didn't she simply call my mom like a normal person? I voiced this question, to which she replied with uncertainty, expressing doubts about whether my mother would ever forgive her or allow her to see me. Please, she implored, this has to be our little secret. Initially, I was skeptical. How could I be sure she was telling the truth? What if she was an undercover cop or had ulterior motives? But at the same time, a sense of excitement welled up within me. I was tired of the monotonous routine of living with just my mother, with no friends to speak of except Stella, who was more of an annoyance than a friend. Keeping this secret from my mother seemed like a small act of rebellion for her own secrecy regarding Kennedy. Kennedy and I continued our conversation for a while, during which I bombarded her with questions about life in the convent, which she described as exceedingly strict. I couldn't help but wonder why she didn't simply leave. Why don't you just leave? I inquired. She somberly explained that she had made a vow to God, one that she couldn't break. A glimmer of light emanated from my mother's bedroom window, signaling that I needed to return inside. Kennedy asked if she could see me again tomorrow, and I agreed. She provided me with a secret cell phone number hidden from the watchful eyes of the convent. Over the subsequent nights, Kennedy became a regular visitor. I confided in her about my mundane life, my mother's excessive chores, and the constant mistreatment from Stella. To my surprise, she proved to be an attentive and compassionate listener. I had expected her to be uptight and restrained due to her religious vocation, but she turned out to be a delightful companion, bringing a spark of excitement to my otherwise dreary existence. My newfound happiness didn't go unnoticed by my mother, but I remained tight-lipped about the source of my joy. It was my secret, and I reveled in it. Then one day, after another round of teasing from Stella, Kennedy proposed that we play a prank on her. Late at night, we ventured to Stella's house. I pointed out Stella's window to Kennedy, who began tapping on it lightly with her fingernail. I struggled to contain my laughter as Stella's bedroom lamp suddenly flickered to life, revealing her in bed. The shock and terror on her face at the sight of a nun outside her window were truly priceless. She screamed at the top of her lungs. Kennedy and I bolted back to my house as quickly as we could, collapsing in laughter. The following day, all Stella could talk about was the ominous visit from the creepy nun, convinced it was a harbinger of her impending doom. She had always been a bit of a drama queen. After school, I texted Kennedy, informing her that my mother would be running errands for a few hours, so she could come over. Kennedy wasn't entirely sure she could sneak out of the convent right away, but she appeared at my doorstep about half an hour later. As I ushered her inside, she looked around the house with wonder, as if unable to believe her eyes. She fixed her gaze on the photos on the shelves, particularly those of my mother. I miss her so much, Kennedy confessed. She admitted that life in the convent no longer held the appeal it once did. She longed for the real world and regretted missing out on watching me grow up. Why don't you consider talking to my mother? I suggested. It's been years. She might be willing to forgive you. Kennedy, however, explained that she wasn't quite ready for such a confrontation. As I shared the hardships of my day, which included failing a quiz and being ignored by Stella in favor of more popular girls, Kennedy had an uncanny ability to cheer me up. I realized that I had never had someone like her in my life, someone I could rely on to always lend an ear. We were so deeply engrossed in our conversation that I didn't even hear the sound of the key in the front door until it was too late. My mother stood in the doorway, staring at Kennedy as if she had seen a ghost. Both Kennedy and I sprang to our feet, and the room fell into a tense silence. Kennedy, too, fixated on my mother, and I held my breath, unsure of what was about to transpire. Would they argue or finally have the long overdue conversation? What Kennedy said next took me completely by surprise. "Hi, Mom," Kennedy whispered. I thought I must have misheard. Why would my godmother call my mother Mom? My mother didn't say anything, so I began to speak. Why didn't you tell me I had a godmother? What were you two fighting about all those years? Can't you make up? But my mother didn't respond to any of these inquiries. Instead, she said, She's not your godmother, she's your sister." I couldn't believe my ears. I felt like the ground had been pulled out from beneath me. How could this be true? I turned to Kennedy seeking answers. "What is she talking about?" I demanded. "You're not my sister." However, Kennedy merely continued to gaze at my mother, tears welling up in her eyes. In that moment, I knew it was true. How could they both have kept this secret from me? I couldn't decide whose betrayal hurt more, my mother's or Kennedy's. "I have a sister, and you didn't tell me?" I yelled at my mother. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and began to recount the story. She and my father had Kennedy when my mother was very young. Their family was deeply religious. When Kennedy was 18 and I was just a baby, she became pregnant and my parents disowned her. My mother still longed to see her daughter from time to time, but my father had banished Kennedy to a convent and ordered her never to return. Kennedy had spent years in the convent, cut off from her friends and family. She had once sent an email to my mom, announcing the birth of her baby and the subsequent adoption. My mother had replied, disclosing that she and my father had raised me without revealing that I had a sister. My mother explained that writing that message had been the most difficult thing she had ever done, but it was what my father had wanted. Yet, it was this act that had ultimately fractured their marriage and caused my mother to lose her faith. She stopped attending church, and she and my father eventually divorced. She confessed that she had wanted to tell me about Kennedy so many times over the years. My mother wanted to invite Kennedy to return home, but she feared it was too late, believing that Kennedy would forever resent her. Kennedy was in tears when my mother finished recounting the story. She expressed her desire to come back home. They were conversing as if I weren't even present, and I could feel my anger building. My mother suggested that if Kennedy decided to break her convent vows, she could stay in the guest room until she found her own place. But I couldn't contain my emotions any longer. "She can't stay here," I screamed. "You both lied to me. I hate you." I then stormed upstairs and locked myself in my room, crying through most of the night. It was a tremendous shock, and I couldn't come to terms with the fact that my newfound friend, the person I had grown to trust so much, was just as deceitful as my parents. Over the next few days, Kennedy sent texts and made calls, but I ignored her. At school, Stella offered an apology for teasing me about the creepy nun. She confessed that she was still frightened at bedtime. I recalled the prank that Kennedy and I had pulled on her, and I almost smiled. However, I knew I had to tell Stella the truth. I recounted the entire story about Kennedy, hoping for her support. But once I had finished, all she seemed interested in was how bizarre my family was and how it resembled something out of a TV show. She didn't really care about my feelings. Instead, she was fixated on the juicy gossip my life provided. At that moment, I realized I didn't want to sever my ties with Kennedy. I had longed for a sister my whole life, and now I had one. Forgiving her would be difficult, but perhaps I could grant her the opportunity to explain herself. So that night, I called Kennedy, and we talked for an extended period. She admitted that she had lied because she feared that if she revealed her true identity as my sister, I would never keep her visits secret from my mom. I didn't know what to do, she confessed. I felt so alone, and I didn't want to jeopardize getting to know you by causing drama. I retorted, "Well, you certainly caused a lot of drama." She acknowledged it with remorse and inquired, "Do you think you could ever give me another chance?" I recognized that it wouldn't be easy for either of us, but if my mother was willing to welcome Kennedy back into our lives, then I could make an effort. "You're my sister," I said. It felt strange to utter those words. "We're family." That appeared to bring her immense joy. "You're my sister," she responded. Kennedy promised to visit my mother and me the following day. As I drifted off to sleep, the phrase, "You're my sister," reverberated in my mind. Perhaps now, both she and I would feel less alone in the world.